All right, so first, thank you very much to all of you for this very nice and insightful presentation this afternoon. So I'd like to open up the panel. I'd like to cover overall 3 topics with you and have sort of bounce your ideas on those 3 ideas. The first one is really going towards technological adoption. So several of you have mentioned these ideas, and what we've learned over the afternoon is that there's technological adoption at a different level, whether it's for health purpose or whether it's for more consumer application. And there's also different type of technology. This morning we were very much centered onto invasive technology. This afternoon we had a mix of non-invasive wearable technology as well as invasive approaches. And so I'd like to hear a little bit about your experience or your prediction maybe on how well a new neurotechnology can be adopted first in the health domain and then in more the general public and consumer space. And I will not point at anyone, so one can start.
Maybe I can just share with you some aspect of in the field of health, because I was lucky enough to be among the people to participate in the development of implants in the early stages. It was in the end of the 80s. We started at La Salpêtrière to have this possibility of implanting in 1989, I think. So in this era, it was clear that the need was incredible because it was for these specific population of Parkinson patients, 5% of the Parkinson population that were with great akinesia, so they are young, rigid, and akinetic. So they were in crucial need. And the technology was appearing for DBS, deep brain stimulation, with a lot of problems, 20% at that time, and still a lot now. You had what was said side effects, and side effects meant at this time either an effect of moods, deep depressions, or hypersexuality, compulsivity. So for the first month or first 2 months, 20%, it means that 1 patient out of 5 experiment these side effects. So it was terrible. But the people were so relieved when they were activating the system. They were not the same person. And as said in one of the slides of Karen, you need to know that when a Parkinson patient is blocked, the ideation of this patient is blocked. So he cannot move, or she cannot move, but he cannot think. And the technology and the possibility to relieve this and to allow movement, also allow ideation. So in the field of health, when it works, even with the side effect, it's really a breakthrough, and it's really something which is improving. And you have to imagine that the life of these persons were changed, not only for the quality of life, which is extremely important, but also for the duration of life, because they increased also their life. So it was an incredible revolution, an incredible advance. So the adoption was immediate, because in this case, you have a terrible, devastating disease on one side, and a wonderful, and even with the side effect, a technology on the other side. So,
but then, can you maybe comment a bit on the scalability of adoption? Because here it's an immediate adoption by those 5 individuals for whom it worked. But how do you actually translate this in then a therapeutical option?
It's terrible for the 95% of Parkinson patients that are not eligible for the technology. It was terrible for a long time for the file to wait for the technology, because the technology was really hardly available at the beginning, even if now most likely 1 million people were implanted all over the world. So obviously, at the very beginning, access was a problem. And most likely in the field of health, what we will face is the lack of access to the technology because of the cost, because of the infrastructure, because of the high level of technology. This is why works such as the one developed by Olivier is so important to lower the technological need and improve accessibility. I don't know how much it will cost your systems.
Further comment, Olivier? Sorry, I'm pointing at you then.
When we started the company with Paul, we had one idea, and one idea only in mind, which was always a mistake, was can we leverage the technology in order to offer possibilities for people who are excluded from society, and especially from the workforce, to enter or re-enter the workforce? Can we leverage brain-computer interfaces, human-machine interfaces, for people to be able to control a workstation or computer? Because if you cannot communicate, you cannot work. If you cannot work, generally you're excluded from society. And it's also a beautiful case of single goal people missing the big picture. Because we thought that as soon as we would provide the technology to vulnerable people, they could basically work. But imagine that our solution works if you have an accident in life or a neurodegenerative disease that prevents you from using your hands after studying. But if your condition has preventing you from studying from the get-go, you can use our technology, but you will not have the skills to work. That's the first bit, is to anchor the technology in the reality of what is needed and the context. The second is, of course, to work with patients, and a lot of things that Paul and I wanted to implement as we worked with Association des Paralysés de France and with people who are in locked-in syndrome and who can only communicate by blinking as you move your finger on an alphabet. You wait for several minutes to have a sentence of someone who tells you this is useless, which is great. That's the second point. The third point is also, how do you move from special project, as I shared with you, Natalie with the arm, Rodrigo with the Formula One, to viable products that can be used on a daily basis and that are affordable and scalable. If you look around the news, you can see hackathons all around the world where brilliant young people are making things move with their mind and a couple of EEG headsets very easily. It's quite easy to make something move with your mind. To make things move with your mind in an accurate fashion that can be used on a daily basis, in a reliable way, so that you can achieve goals, it's a totally different game, and we're facing it. Now the last point is, and thank you for the assist, is accessibility and price. Like with any medical or non-medical device, the question is always at the end, who pays for it? Our goal with Paul was to make our solution less expensive than any subsidy the government would give to any employer employing a person with a disability. Because we thought that if there is no added expense, basically the government is giving, this is out of the blue, but 5,000 euros a year for a person with a certain disability to be employed, where if our solution is less than 5,000 euros, then voila. It's not as easy as that, because unfortunately, when you look at what the regulation is imposing, which is for most companies in the European Union to have 6% people with disability, you talk to the employers, the HR departments of a lot of big companies, and they tell you, oh, we're doing great, we're at 7.2, we're at 7.6, so we're fine, thank you. And that has nothing to do with money.
Okay. So, Jen, do you have a follow-up comment on technological adoption and whether what are the options and what are a path to actually accelerate this?
Well, of course I do. Yeah. Actually, I have a couple of points to make when we think about neurotechnology and the development. One hindrance and challenge that neurotechnology has had over the development of time is this theory of last resort for adoption. So, for instance, when we think about vagus nerve stimulation for epilepsy, the language that goes along with the approval is that it's for treatment-resistant epilepsy. That means that someone needs to go through several treatments before they can even consider that device. And we see that in a lot of other cases as well, and that hinders the adoption of technology. Even though it might be a fantastic fit for that person, the language around that ends up putting it later in the clinical process. So I think that's a big challenge that we need to get over when we think about adoption. The second point is that when we think about adoption, we have to think about, we run a lot of clinical trials on clinical efficacy. So we look at clinical efficacy, and that ends up being our endpoint, but we don't always look at functional efficacy. So we might have an endpoint that we can measure that we say, oh, okay, we have additional movement of a finger, but is that finger actually functional for that person in the world, getting to Olivia's point of being able to function in the world, of how people will actually adopt it. And just to give you kind of an interesting use case, when I was interviewing one of the first retinal prosthesis users, one of her complaints was that the aesthetics of it, she was afraid to wear it out in society. Now, she's blind. Most people would think, why would she care what a pair of glasses look like when she's going out into society? But that was actually a hindrance for her. So I think we have to think about the functional use and how people use these use the technologies outside of the laboratory, outside of the clinic, and inside of society and how they function. There's also concerns, and this was already brought up in terms of payers, but I think we have to start to really look at the economic case of neurotechnologies. Instead of looking at, which we tend to do in the US, is we tend to look at a very short-term gain compared to a pharmaceutical, but looking over the lifetime of that patient and making that economic case for neurotechnology. There's also a big concern about abandonment. When we do surveys of users, particularly for surgery, one of their biggest concerns is having to go back into surgery. What if the technology fails and I have to go back into surgery? So that's another area that is a challenge for adoption. Finally, this gets back to my third point of this area of adoption, is really giving a good understanding of risk versus benefit. So for instance, if I can go back to work, how much of risk am I going to take to be able to achieve that goal? And that goes back to really engagement early in on the development of the device, so we can get a very clear understanding of risk versus benefit instead of trying to address that when we're looking for regulatory approval. So I think those are some of the themes I think that go along with adoption of technology in the health space.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. Karen?
Yeah, I was having this conversation at the recent AI for Good Summit. There was a cluster of us who were, I think we called ourselves the Neurotech family or whatever, who were there in this AIC. And I was talking to an individual who had developed, arguably it's a neurotechnology, maybe you might not think it is, but works with the EMG, and he's an engineer. And he was lamenting how he had wished he had gotten some patients involved or end users involved earlier. But he also talked about how with some of the other startups, some of them who weren't developing clinically applications for their technology, how the standard practice of engaging an potential end user usually doesn't come until you're in the product phase, in the product design phase, and rather than in the research phase. And they in fact said, maybe they're wrong, but they in fact said that it was kind of challenging to even get more funding directed to that in the research phase. And the second point that they brought up, and I am curious about which way you'll wave your head this time, is just about how to think about a more, just the engineer's tension and just the desire to like really get something formed to a certain level before having more variables come in and people try to mess it up. So there's always this tension of how early is too early to bring in the end user. And actually what he had proposed, or then another person proposed, was perhaps an interesting idea is to think about this, just like you iterate on your prototype at early stages, that you would push yourself outside of your comfort zone to iterate with an end user too. And so this would be more of a, rather than waiting till a user design phase, thinking about putting it up front. But this is probably antithesis of what you do with inclusive brains. What do you think?
Already spoken. Laura. No.
I have a different point.
Okay. I would say business 101. A lot of people who are working on assistive technologies and neurotech come from the science world, and they think that because they are scientists, they're going to be great entrepreneurs, or because they are geniuses and they invent a great product, the mass, is going to adopt it. I don't know about you, but a lot of the things that are sold, the best sellers, are not the most advanced technologies, or the greatest things, or have the biggest impact. And there is an ego thing. It's like I'm inventing something with the best intentions at heart, and we made that mistake. It is not because you have the best intentions that you're going to do some good. You're going to do some good if you talk to the people you want to help and you understand their needs, and then you dedicate your work to help them with their needs. This is having impact. Otherwise, it's an impact on your ego, which is great. I mean, I was a researcher just researching for myself because I loved it. But it's a totally different ballgame. And then the last point is, this is a business. It is not a charity. At some point, you need to get money in. And the fact that it is assistive tech does not mean that you're not going to make money. The remote control, Siri, Alexa, vocal assistants, SMS, faxes have been invented to help people with disabilities. And then it got adopted by the mass consumption and became formidable markets with high margins, and even changed the way, take the remote control, helping someone with disability to change the channels on a TV set, change the way all of us with gray hair and who are more than 20 interacted with technology at some point of our lives, with our stereo, air conditioning, etc. So assistive tech does not mean charity, does not mean that at some point you cannot break the market. But in order to break the market, whomever your consumers are, you need to understand their needs and to deliver on their needs.
I just wanted to clarify, I'm not going to say much more, but there was, I started with the example of assistive, but there's also the conversation of people who are developing, not for clinical purposes at all. Anyway, sorry. Which is still a business thing.
Thanks, Karen. Well, that was a super rich answer so far. The only point I'm still seeing on my notes here is conversations that we've been having around one of the principles in the recommendation in your communication to the public to avoid hype and overstatement. And so when we think about tech adoption, one of the things that we have been hearing is in terms of reoccurring challenge is that the danger that comes from mis and disinformation, and that the nicest technology that might be sitting in a lab might never be adopted by the broad population if there's something they call it in neurotech backlash, where people will just not put something into their brains or will not be willing to use it. So that again underlines the need for clear and good communication and the reliable sources and channels to do so. And there, of course, there's the distinction between the motivation that we've been hearing about from people from the applications in the health space versus in the consumer market, where people pay from this with their own money most of the time, which is where if they are not willing to use this, then they won't. And depending on which information bubble they sit in, this can be a real problem for developers. They can have the nicest technology. If nobody's willing to use it, then it will remain on the shelves.
Thank you. And many of you, or several of you, have actually talked about inclusion or inclusivity, and neurotechnology today is very much seen as a Western world challenge or view. And I'd be curious to also hear about your opinion about how we can actually bring access to this technology also to non-Western world, so Africa in particular, and so on. So what are the extra challenges that actually do not allow this transfer of technology to the largest members of the planet?
Obviously, the first challenge is to fight against our selfishness, which means that we are very happy to welcome student scientists coming from everywhere in the world, whether it is from Latin America, Africa, or Asia. And we are making, as always, a brain drain. We are dragging the best one, and we try to stabilize them in our lab. So first, we need to train and to allow the development of universities with research in the global south. And once these infrastructures will be developed and the people who know will be on site, and we begin to see that in some countries, Morocco, South Africa, we start to see the possibility to translate. We start to see the possibility to have well-trained doctors in the hospitals. We see the possibility to have the people that need this technology access to the technology. And then we need to have a global economy that is not as it was done in the 80s and 90s, downsizing the infrastructures, the medical health infrastructures, downsizing the university and things like that. So it's a global question, but first we need the people, and we need the people on site.
Okay, thank you. Any other points?
That is for the access to healthcare. If we're talking about markets, if you want to be able to scale a technology so that everyone can afford it, for it to be affordable, you need to sell a lot. You need to lower your production cost, your distribution cost. So it is very much, when we talk about high-level neurotech, it's very much a G7, maybe G20 issue. There are great tech that are being developed in China at the moment. So it's not just East-West, but more, as you mentioned, Southern, Northern. But if we do not make or use the privilege that we have to be in developed, rich countries where we can experiment, advance clinical trials, go to market, sell, create a market so that we lower the price, we will never be able to share the technology with the countries that do not have the core infrastructure to develop it. Sadly, there are countries that even if we welcome all the scientists, which is very pretentious of us to say we will welcome the scientists so that they can learn with us. I mean, they're doing some pretty damn good things where they are. But if you go back to your country with some learnings from Stanford, from Harvard, you name it, and you don't have the critical infrastructure in order to practice, or I'm sad to, reality check, if you don't even have electricity in your country or wherever you live, what good is it going to do? Mm-hmm. And I think this is part also of what we want to achieve. It's developing products that are affordable, that are scalable, but something that Hervé mentioned during his brilliant lecture, the fact that we also need to lower the demand on resources, computational resources, energy resources for AI models, for example, what is referred to as, in French, AI frugal, or pruning models. Because the the lower you need in terms of energy, computational and processing demand, the more chances to scale. Hence, an approach that we have of these small AI agents rather than large models, which are amazing but demanding resources that are crazy.
Okay. Jen, do you want to comment also?
I won't beat the drum of infrastructure because I think it's already been mentioned twice, but I think it was a good point that Olivia made was in terms of electricity. So when we think about neurotech, so much is based on batteries, and how do we recharge those batteries when we're going from country to country? I think that's a really important point. In terms of access, that has been mentioned, but I would like to add a layer of that in terms of durability. Of the durability of devices to be able to be deployed in different environments. We have our health infrastructure here in the West, and in China they have a eloquent health system as well. But when we look at countries that are not as well off as we are, they don't have those health infrastructures. And how do we deploy devices like that? I think one other thing to add to the conversation is that we need to be very conscious of the social and cultural differences of disability that exist around the world. For how we might treat that in Europe or in France or in the UK or even in the US is going to be very different of how it's being treated in Nigeria or Kenya or in Thailand. So we need to be very conscious of the social and cultural differences of disability and of illness and disease and how it's portrayed in those areas of the world.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Karen, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I was trying to figure out where I wanted to start with that one. I mean, I'll try to keep it brief. So I think one exciting thing about neurotechnology is actually that it's not just one technology. It's kind of it's paradigmatic of a converging technology. So it's enabled by AI, different kinds of learnings and software and hardware, which we usually think of. And there are pieces of that are more affordable than others. I'm thinking about, you'll know about this, when the African Neurodata Network, and what they've done is tried to not create a bunch of technology builds there, but they're trying to give capacity building for local scientists to do kinds of data analytics pieces and also to manage large amounts of brain data. And then they can also have the power to do the kinds of experiments that they think are going to be valuable locally. And also they can then become leaders in that space. And they'll be the prestigious site that other, and already have become, a place where researchers from around the world will go. So I think that there is a model of that. I'm also aware of, and I don't think the onus should just be on individuals, but I do like to highlight good examples. I know of someone who actually was originally from Chile, but he wasn't going to, he set up his business actually in Europe because he had more resources there and knew how to leverage the investments there. But he insisted that he wanted to also have a branch back home so that he could also be benefiting that local community. Now, that's not to say that everybody can do that or has to do that, but it's an interesting model to consider, especially if there are ways to partner with getting combined private funding and then maybe other public funding matches to further develop those resources. And I think the other thing that I would say is a value in just to value, there is a value in doing, getting out of your comfort zone and thinking about what is my technology going to look like in a variety of settings, not just because there's a spectacle of the other and how different someone else in another country might believe, but also it helps to demonstrate perhaps some of the nuances we might have some of that difference in us and those differences in perspectives in our communities. And that helps us think more about the adoption question that you brought up front. So I'm thinking of, in 2013, China passed its first ever mental health care law, and that's a longer story that I'll tell you over drinks or something of what happened there. But there's a lot of interest in trying to bring certain kinds of research there and modernize, some exciting like eye tracking work and predictive work for assessing dementia and things like that, or predicting risk for dementia. But part of the problem they faced is a similar, you get a similar retention problem for some of these research studies. But what they hadn't anticipated was just Confucianism, like the drawing, the metaphor for everything is the family. And so to even participate in a study where you're predicting a risk of Alzheimer's, just participating in that could have implications for your entire family, in what stages. And that wasn't something that was really considered when the technology was kind of imported from the US and there was excitement about having a Chinese collaborator. And it's not to say only Chinese colleagues will feel that way, but that's something we will experience in the West as well. But I think there's another way to conceptualize the opportunity in doing such work.
Thank you. Well, one of the points I haven't heard from the panel yet, but which was discussed earlier this afternoon, was the issue of algorithm bias in terms of the development of devices that, and then in one cultural context and then transferring them to another where they might not work in the same way. But actually the responses from the other panelists made me think of a non-neurotech example, but which I found extremely inspiring, which came from the work I previously did in a medical device company that built dialysis machines. And the example is from the work with indigenous communities they did in Australia. So I think there are a couple of points that resonated, which could easily then also be translated into the into neurotech context. So first of all, the indigenous communities in Australia have a very high prevalence of renal disease. So they are essentially a huge population that they are in need of treatment. With hemodialysis machines, but of course they live in very remote communities. So what they have been put into place there are buses, so renal dialysis buses that drove out in the outback, and they put super new machines into these buses, but these populations wouldn't use them. They were afraid of the machines. They were blinking. They're making sounds. They were just afraid of the machines, and they would not want to be plugged onto them. So there was the company then decided to reach out to the communities and to understand what were their fears and to bring them into a little or into an R&D process in which they brought really from a Westerner perspective old machines. Like they showed them machines that in theory would have not been used in the Western world anymore because they had buttons and they weren't nice displays or anything. And they also they used artists to communicate to them in these beautiful arts that you probably know with the buttons, to explain to them that the resource of water is being used, and so the way how the product was framed and explained to them was done in a completely different way. So from a Westerner perspective, it was plugging them onto old machines, but the alternative had been to present them to machines that they were afraid of. So this was an example where I worked for this company at the time, which I found extremely inspiring, and it actually resulted in a huge adoption of the technology and acceptance of these populations to use it, even though it was from a Western perspective old technologies that they used, but they in that way could save many lives. And through the framing, the use, and bringing these communities into a development process that was, from a Westerner perspective, retro modeling old machines, but it allowed them to come up with beautiful ones, and that they then put into the buses, and there was a huge acceptance and use of them.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So now I'd like to go to a second topic, which will be around the players and the implementation. So we've heard this afternoon that there are multiple stakeholders in the neurotech domain as a whole, from patient, medical doctors, scientists, engineers, investors, etc. And we've also learned that there are many directions where people are thinking of how in which framework, in which format, in which standard should we actually deploy this technology. But at the risk of being a bit provocative, concretely, how are we going to do this? Because it's nice to have standards and charter, but who is going to read the 140 pages of the document and then concretely extract the information so that actually on the field we're actually implementing these. So I know it's a bit provocative, but it's but it would be interesting to see really how, now that we have these frameworks or this proposition for frameworks, how do we actually concretely go and bring the different players together to implement neurotechnology?
Well, okay. I'll take a stab at that. Actually, so part of my story is that I had was a longtime professor, and I quit that during the pandemic, actually in November 2021. And I think, like many people, I still maintain an adjunct position. But I left that because I felt like I wasn't making enough of a difference, actually. And that's not to say that some people aren't making that difference in the university at all. But what I was seeing was that I had been a part of many beautiful, well-written 140-page documents that maybe only those of us who wrote it read. So I had all these basically, paperweights and doorstops that were just very well researched. And one of the things in our lab, my lab also did analyses of the existing guidance that was out there, and I told you that there's over 20 of them. And we identified a couple challenges with them. I mean, one to be clear, like a lot of these soft law instruments that are guidance, they're meant to be norm setting. They're not meant to be these concrete, detailed things of what you do. So there are certain expectations we have to set of certain documents. So, and Laura, I think, can talk more about that with why the OECD uses the way that it does to use its member states to implement. But another challenge we identified was that actors weren't particularly called out. So certainly it's good to have co-creative processes where you're bringing multiple perspectives in. We know that generates more creative problem solving. But in the end, we also have to have clarity about which groups can actually do what. So this is why I chose one little tiny piece of the puzzle, which was the small to medium enterprise. I felt like that was a group really making a difference in neurotech. That was a group that was really going to have an opportunity to develop some best practices, and I wanted to pilot with them. So what we did was I did exactly what you were kind of talking about. I took some of these guidance, and I said, what do you think? And they were like, I don't know what this means. Of course I care about privacy and prioritizing health or whatever, but what does that mean for me day to day? And I really had to be embedded to understand what does it look like? What does it look like for an engineer? What does it look like for a product designer? What does it look like for sales? And then what can each of them actually do in that process? So one big problem that, for example, that people were concerned about was misuse. So I haven't met any yet. I mean, there are some, but really the people I've met went into neurotechnology not because it was easy, because they were trying to solve a big problem for the world. I mean, it also happened to be engineering, exciting on engineering front. But they really want to help people, and they're worried about, most of them actually have this kind of bias against the military. I don't know if sometimes it's founded, sometimes it's not. So what can you do in that case? Well, you can just say, well, we make peaceful items, But then you can say, well, what is that going to mean when I'm at a second phase of growth and partnerships are coming in and trying to use my technology? How am I going to assert those values? So we've actually built conversation tool rubrics for interviewing potential partners, and so that's just kind of a conversation decision-making tool. But the second thing we developed was more contractual, where we actually tailored their acceptable use policies to specify in which context they could be used, and made that part of the contract. So that's just one tiny kind of example of how you can translate that. But that was not something I would have been able to do on my own. I had to go into that, embed myself into that company to understand their values, how they wanted to play that out, and what it would look like with the existing instruments that they used.
Okay, thank you. Other reactions, Liliane?
Of course, the point on misuse is always brought up. But you can take any technology, any innovation, any invention throughout history has been hijacked from its initial purposes by very bad people. What is very interesting nowadays is whether we're talking about neurotechnology or artificial intelligence, people are more afraid by technology that works, that has not harmed yet, that low technology that does not work, and that has done a lot of harm. And I'm back to my point on surveys, questionnaires, psychometrics. Lots of careers have been ruined because some HR person has not liked the results at a paper pencil survey. Lots of kids have been discriminated based on IQ tests. Weapons of mass discrimination that are totally unregulated and that have a track record, beyond my opinion, of ruining lives. That we don't care. Now we got very high-tech, AI and neurotech, that can be misused, but so far have not, and everyone is super worried about it. My first call is let's regulate based on outcomes. Low-tech and high-tech should be regulated the same way based on the harm that can be done. No, if you take a bucket of water and a towel, you can do something called waterboarding, which is pure torture. Are you going to regulate buckets, water, and a towel based on the fact that some people can use it for torture? No. What you regulate about is that torture is unacceptable, the outcome. That's the first point. The second point is that in today's world, with hypercommunication, leaks of data, I'm talking about data intelligence, market intelligence, patents, etc. It's impossible for a company to do bad things without the world knowing it. Companies, whether you believe it or not, have all the interest in the world. It's in their best interest to play by the book, to respect their consumers, because at some point it's going to backlash. Yes, some companies had a role, private companies had a good role until it backlashed, but it will come out eventually. And you'll have to be accountable for it and you'll pay for it. And this is why VCs, private equity, family offices, in their due diligence processes these days, they care about ethics, they care about data privacy, they care about the fact that we're going to be able to comply or not with AI, the AI regulation that is coming about the EU. You might find this a naive standpoint, but at the end of the day, if you want to survive in business, you have to play by the book, especially if you're a small company like us. But big companies also can be destroyed like that. They are still doing things that are not acceptable, but of all the companies I've worked with, I've never worked with Meta, so let me just speak about Meta. Meta has a chief AI scientist, Yann Lequin, that has imposed open source science, not for their private IP, their secret source, but open source science, that has contaminated, positively contaminated how Google works, how Microsoft works. Why? Because they wanted to share, which is also in their business interest. There is a business interest in sharing. There is a business interest in being transparent. Of course, there is a business interest also in hiding, etc. But at some point, it will eventually be known, and you'll pay for it. There are so many examples out there, and one of them in neurotechnology today with an implant that is not going so well.
All right, a quick rebound from Karen, and then I think Jen, maybe?
It's not really a... Oh, did you want to... Jen,
But-
you had some-
No, go ahead, Karen, and then I'll go with you.
it's not a rebuttal, but an inspiration you know, what you were mentioning there was law and regulation, and it reminded me of the mistake sometimes, not that you're making, but that sometimes people make with not understanding the tool that they have before them. So, you know, a charter or guidance isn't regulation, and also another flip thing is, you know, being compliant and having a privacy document doesn't make you ethical either. So, and I think what I hear a lot of people talk about is consent. It's everything about the consent. We just need to get that in. That's true, but it's part of a multi-layered process. People also misunderstand what consent is. It's not a moment. It's a process, and so it's not. And it's never been. It was never conceptualized to be the only thing to preserve human dignity. And so I think we have to understand that all these pieces work together, and we have to understand what the reasonable expectations of each tool are to do in a variety of settings.
Thank you. Jennifer?
Yeah, if I could bring back to the question of implementation, and specifically in the health space. I think one of the exciting things that we have in neurotech is that there are some rules around, you know, how we operate in business, how we operate clinically, But we have an opportunity to shape those rules going forward because there's so many unanswered questions that we have around this new technology or this new tool that we have before us, as Karen had mentioned. I think one of the things that we have to think about is in terms of how do we do the language around this and how do we use the tools that we have so we can shape those rules going forward so it will be in the favor of ethical and responsible implementation. Just one thing that, we just had this conversation yesterday in one of our working groups for the Implantable BCI collaborative community, of which we are very transparent, so I can talk about this, was around the challenges of modularity. How do we implement a full system where we're always looking at a full system, but how do we break that apart into modularity? Very much of the way that we think about how we use computers, where we have different peripherals that connect to it. We could potentially do that with neurotechnology as well, but there's no rules around that. There's no guidance around that. So we have an opportunity to shape that. And with that, I think we have, some areas that are underused in medicine of implementation science and regulatory science, which is basically, when I say regulatory science, it's not just looking at the regulators. The real definition, which was actually just published recently, was that it creates a dialogue for launching new ideas and determining how best to allow those ideas to interact with society. And not only in regulatory authorities, but throughout society with the multiple stakeholders. So I think when we look at that definition, maybe we need to take that to heart when we start to look at our opportunities that we have to shape the rules on how we operate in the neurotech space.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'd like to now, just looking at the time, also open for potential question from the audience before I have the last topic I want to cover.